Hello, welcome to Civic Conversations. I am your host, Marvin Key. On today's episode, we welcome Dr. Kathleen Thelen, Ford Professor of Political Science at MIT. Dr. Thelen's award-winning research agenda centers on the political economy of rich democracies. That is, she helps us understand what occurs at the intersection of government, politics, and the market. She's the author and co-author of numerous books and articles, including Attention Shoppers, American Retail Capitalism and the Origins of the Amazon Economy, and Off Balance, How U.S. Courts Privilege Conservative Policy Outcomes, co-authored with Brian Highsmith and Maya Sen. We'll include links to both in the show notes. Kathy, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much.
What I find fascinating about your research is how you blend American and comparative politics. So given your perspective studying economic institutions across rich countries, briefly tell us how American capitalism is distinct from other countries' capitalist systems.
There are so many ways in which the U.S. is kind of an outlier compared to all the other pure, rich, advanced capitalist democracies. I'll just mention two that figure pretty prominently in the work that I've done on political economy specifically. One is that regulatory authority in the United States, unlike in other countries, is really spread across a bunch of different branches, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, and also different levels of governance, right? So the national, the federal, the state, and the local level. And that's a configuration that comparativists like Stepan and Lintz have shown is connected to higher levels of inequality. And why might that be the case? Well, partly because this whole system of checks and balances that we have in the United States, which is often sort of celebrated, actually contains a much larger number of veto points, more points of access for interest group influence, but also more points at which policies can go off the rails, right? So if you want to block government action, which is something that organized business interests often want to do, they want government not to do a lot. They want the less it does in many ways to regulate them, the better. And all of these veto points really mean that the United States is sort of full of moments in which progressive legislation can be blocked. And so this is just all really pretty different from parliamentary systems in Europe, which have, first of all, they have a fusion rather than a separation of executive and legislative power, right? Whoever wins whichever party or whichever coalition wins the election, by definition, that executive has a majority in the legislature. So that means that coalition or that party is empowered to implement the policy, the program on which it was elected. That enhances transparency. If you didn't like what they did, don't vote for them again. And it's not a mystery who's responsible for, government legislation. It's very clear. These parties are elected on the platform, and they have the wherewithal and the majorities that they need to implement that program. So that enhances that legitimacy. That enhances, this sort of it's clear to voters what they're going to get. The other thing that comes out a lot in the research that I've done is the power of the courts, which the United States is just really alone among peer advanced capitalist democracies in the power and the politicization of the courts. We get legislation that's built up over, consensus building across the different branches and within Congress, within the Senate, within the House of Representatives, and with the executive. All of that can happen. And then the whole thing can be shut down, can be nullified by the votes of 5 members of the Supreme Court that is not in any meaningful way accountable to the public. So why is this important? It's like capitalist markets, by their very nature, are constantly generating inequality. That's what markets do. That's what capitalist markets do. And so how do you countervail that? The only way to countervail that is through democracy, and is through democratically accountable policy that can counteract the inequalities that are just inevitably generated by market forces. And so what you have in the United States is a very veto-ridden political economic environment that gives organized business interests just all kinds of ways to intervene to block policy initiatives. So that's one big sort of overarching factor that figures a lot in the research that I've been doing. The other one that's more specific to the retail book that you mentioned, the Amazon book, has to do with labor law in the United States. So the United States is literally the only country among peer democracies, again, in which workers have to fight to win the right to organize, to win the right for representation, to win the right to even negotiate with employers, let alone reach a contract with employers and get the kind of coverage that you can only get if you're negotiating collectively with other workers. Any individual worker in a relationship to any individual employer is, of course, in a situation of extreme inequality, extreme asymmetries of power. So the only way that you can sort of counteract that is through collective organization. And in the U.S., it's just unusually difficult, almost impossible, to even win those rights in the first place. And you have to win an election in particular workforce. And if you win an election in one, say Starbucks, that doesn't mean that you get to negotiate for all Starbucks workers. You know you have to win that battle in every single little Starbucks outlet. European countries just have many, many, many more supports for the collective representation of workers, more supports for both for collective bargaining and through unions, but also supports for labor input into plant level decision making through things like forest councils at plant level, so that you're correcting these extreme asymmetries of power. And as a consequence of that, one of the things that I talk about in the book is that, you know, other countries, unions are in decline in all countries, and union representation in the United States is down to some 10%. But there are other countries in Europe that are also down around those levels of union membership. But what's very different is that you have much higher levels in Europe because of all these other supports for collective representation. You have much higher levels of union bargaining coverage. So the difference is between how many workers belong to a union, that could be small or that could be large. The real question is how many workers, whether or not they belong to a union, how many of those workers are covered by contracts that are negotiated collectively by unions or by works councils. That number is way higher in most European countries than it is in the United States because of the particular way that our labor laws were written and the particular powers that they give to employers to fight union representation. That plays a big role in the retail book that I wrote because retail workers are classically among the most precariously employed, least, have the lowest wages, the most insecure jobs, the most unstable work hours of any constituency in the U.S.
Once upon a time, I worked retail and I've worked fast food. And one thing that I really resented about it was the just-in-time scheduling.
Yeah.
How you had no control over your schedule. And then they might bring you in and say you're going to get 6 hours, but then you only get 3 hours and they send you home. So you get less pay than you're expecting, but then you're scheduled out of any other employment somewhere else.
Yeah.
And labor unions can help with that. In Europe, through their institutions and the design of government, there's more guardrails on capitalism. Here, it seems we have fewer guardrails, but it seems that critics of European-style capitalism will, I believe, mischaracterize it as socialism and then assume that the listener assumes that that's a bad. Is it a myth to call European capitalism socialism per se? And are there any other myths that you think Americans might have about the European business model? And the reason that those myths are important to me is, does that then prevent us from learning from the European capitalist model in ways that could help American workers here?
Yeah, there's so much confusion among Americans about, this whole social democratic model that you find in many European countries and in its strongest forms in in Northern European countries like Scandinavia. Um, the idea that that it's governments against markets is just so wrong. It's so the opposite of how things work. For my classes, I actually have, I can say that to my students, but it's another thing for them to hear it from a Scandinavian. And so every year I bring in a union representative, an economist who works for the Swedish unions, who is, the peak trade union confederation. And he tells them, and it kind of blows their mind, that no, these are very capitalist economies. They're extremely successful capitalist economies. They live entirely on exports. So they're extremely competitive in international markets. And no, the labor movement and Social Democrats are not against markets. They want markets to work better. So basically, a lot of it comes down to, yes, social democracy and social democratic countries have very big welfare states. And yes, that is in part paid for by especially consumption taxes, sort of income taxes, but especially consumption taxes, value added taxes in particular. But basically, the trade-off is a lot of the stuff that we have to buy privately in the United States is covered by the government. So, in the United States, higher education, which your students will know as well as mine, that is hugely expensive for most families. Daycare, again, an enormous expense these days. And in Boston, it costs you $25,000 a year to get your kid in a sort of daycare center. Pensions, you don't have to worry so much about your retirement, right? So all of these things that we have to sort of save for. So you have to set aside part of your income to cover all of these costs. A lot of that is covered by these more generous welfare states. But the other thing that I always emphasize to my students is that the labor movement in social democratic countries and social democrats generally, they do not want the state to override the market. They want markets to work well. They want companies to be able to earn profits that they can then reinvest in the country, right? So corporate tax rates, I just looked this up today, actually. Corporate tax rates in Denmark and Sweden, so the classically most, social democratic countries, or in the U.S., if you talk to people, that's the ones that are seen as most socialist. Their corporate tax rates are very, very, very comparable. In fact, Sweden is lower than that in the United States. So Denmark has a corporate tax rate now of 22%. Sweden has a corporate tax rate of 20.6%, and in the U.S. it's 21%, right?
Interesting.
Yeah, and that's before you add on state corporate taxes, right? So if you looked at the average corporate tax rate across all states, including federal and state taxes together, it comes up to 25.8% in the U.S. compared to 22 and 20.6% in these quote unquote socialist countries. So the point of social democracy is not to block the market, to block market forces. It is instead to facilitate the movement of firms always upmarket into higher value added, higher quality goods that can sustain higher wages, because you need people to be in the job market and earning in order to be able to pay the income taxes that pay for all these other goods and services. So basically, social democracy would, especially in these very exposed economies, these very export dependent economies, they do nothing to prop up uncompetitive companies that could only survive by sweating labor, by driving wages down. They do not engage in that kind of protectionism, nor, though, do they subsidize companies that could only compete by lowering prices and pushing those costs back onto workers. So basically, instead, what they're doing, as the union person puts it, we don't protect jobs, we protect workers, because they allow those uncompetitive firms to go under. That's a function of the market. That's not the state disappearing those companies. That's the market weeding those companies out. And meanwhile, what the state does do is it facilitates, through retraining, the movement of workers who are displaced by those kinds of company failures, helping them move out of these lower value added, lower quality segments of the market into higher value added, higher quality segments of the market that allow these companies and these countries really to compete on the basis of things other than price. Because if you're competing on the basis of price, you are lost in this market. Advanced capitalist economies cannot ever push the prices, the wages of workers down to a level that would match those of some of these developing countries. So that's the social democratic model. It's not a model that inhibits the market. In many ways, it's a model that like facilitates the market. It facilitates the movement of capital and labor out of losing industries and into more competitive segments of these markets.
This is the best explanation I've had of how European-style capitalist systems work. And there's a lot of concepts there that we could talk all semester about this. And in fact, you do for your classes. But I think about the subsidies here that would not be offered in other countries. And I think going back, some of the lessons we've learned from, say, NAFTA back in the 90s when you had the stereotypical textile workers who lost their jobs and then the retraining was really not sufficient. We were worried about jobs, but not workers, to your point, that you might see in Northern European countries. I do want to pivot here because a lot of your interest is also on the courts and conservative policy outcomes. And I'm hoping you can provide an example of a conservative policy outcome that American courts have privileged as it relates to our capitalist system.
Yeah, I mean the book that I'm working on right now is actually on the use of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce of the courts to achieve many of their organized businesses' interests, kind of on the down low, sort of beyond the control of democratic, accountability, because the courts operate on these sort of obscure legal doctrines. Often these cases are very sort of technical and require a lot of legal expertise even to try to make sense of them. So a couple of things. One would be arbitration. It used to be, mandatory arbitration clauses are now quite ubiquitous. So mandatory arbitration clauses that are slipped into either consumer, like if you open a Bose, if you open the package on a Bose speaker, you have already agreed to. If there's a problem, if you want to raise an issue, you've already agreed to bring that through mandatory arbitration. If you look at the fine print on a lot of employment contracts, not just for high skill workers, but for low skill workers as well, you'll find a clause that says that if you have a problem with us, a labor problem with us, that has to run through mandatory arbitration. You can't sue us basically in court. And so what does that mean? People are signing away their rights, often without even realizing it. And this was not something that happened overnight. This is the result of a long series of small incremental changes in the law where employers and businesses were just pushing, and they would win some small technical victory on some issue, and they would push the next step in all of this, such that now we have mandatory arbitration really ubiquitous in all sorts of consumer goods contracts and employment contracts. So that's one sort of general thing that took a long time. But then the other thing is just what I was saying earlier about how you can go through all this long process, this arduous legislative process of cobbling together a consensus or at least a coalition to pass some legislation. And then that whole thing can be kind of wiped away with the stroke of a pen if 5 very unrepresentative Americans decide that goes beyond what the government or an agency is empowered to do. And so this comes up time and again in environmental cases. This was true in the Obama administration, where you had these long processes to get action on protecting the environment. And many of those were contested by the Chamber of Commerce or by organized business successfully in the courts, such that those rules were then just nullified.
Are organized labor and consumer groups just manned and outgunned. With the example of arbitration, I can see how without organized labor, individual employees aren't going to have a union to go to for job protection. But then for consumer groups, if I'm opening up a new box of speakers, are consumer groups pushing back on that, or is it just a matter of scale and they just can't keep up with the avalanche of incremental policy regulations in businesses' interests?
So there the issue is, well, first, it's sort of labor is quite weak and kind of on its heels at the moment, although very popular actually in recent years. The popularity of unions has gone way up. Public opinion about unions, I think people realize that unions can do a lot of good in the world. But the reality is that the rules, the laws, the way that labor law is written is kind of stacked against them. It not only gives them weak powers to sort of organize, but it also empowers employers to fight back against union organization drives in a way that, again, is totally unique among pure democracies. And consumers are kind of notoriously unorganized. So those are like part of the problems on that side of things. But the other thing is courts are great for certain agendas. They're really all they can do is block stuff. They can never generate positive policy, right? So they are asymmetrically useful precisely to those groups who want the government to do less. And so if you want the government to do more, like more in terms of protecting workers or protecting consumers, you're not going to be able to do that in the courts. And to the extent that this court has been extraordinarily sympathetic to the free speech rights of corporations and to the property rights of corporations. I put free speech rights, your students can't see it, but in air quotes, because the idea that corporations have rights that are analogous to individuals is, again, something in which the U.S. there's no counterpart that gives corporations. Like in the European laws do not give corporations speech rights or religious rights or a lot of these rights that we typically think of as attributable to or assigned to attached to individuals are attached to corporations in this country. So as long as all of that is the case, these groups have really uphill battles to fight, and I'm afraid that's where we're at. But one could imagine the current moment being one in which people think outside the box a little bit about the kinds of reforms that we might be able to undertake to make this small system much more democratic.
Well, to that point, I have a future episode where I have a law professor who's going to talk about American tradition versus Bullock, where Montana was trying to regulate the free speech rights of corporations in terms of limiting corporate spending in state elections. And the Supreme Court said they could not have that regulation. So they were trying to regulate it because they recognized that in our post-Citizens United world, what corporate spending has done in elections has really tilted the playing field. We're about out of time. And so I'd like to once again thank Kathy Thelen, Ford Professor of Political Science at MIT, for taking time to appear on Civic Conversations. With my final question, what one article or book would you recommend to help listeners, especially college students, develop a proper perspective of American capitalism as they are entering the full-time workforce?
So this is going to sound self-serving, but it's a book that I collaborated on. It's a compendium. It's an edited volume that contains chapters on all of these ways in which the U.S. stands out in comparative perspective when it comes to to political economy or political economic issues. It's called The American Political Economy, Markets, Politics, and Power. And it was published by Cambridge University Press in 2022, and it was co-edited by my colleagues Jacob Hacker, Alex Hertel-Fernandez, Paul Pierson, and myself. But it contains contributions both by Americanists, people who study the American system, and also comparativists. And so you have, and across a broad range of different issue areas. This is what I use in my graduate classes. And so there's chapters on the courts, there's chapters on the sort of system of checks and balances, there's chapters on the role of big tech, et cetera. So this is the one that I would recommend.
I'm going to include a link to that in the show notes. Dr. Kathy Thelen, thank you for your time and really appreciate your insights.
Really a pleasure talking to you.